Theodore Arult Dodges. Alexander. Chapter 2. Early History of War. The first reliable history of war is found in the Bible. The next comes from Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. All ancient historians are properly military historians. During the Middle Ages, chronicles were kept, but no history was written, and war, as an art, was at a low ebb. It was the French Revolution which first developed the national sentiment and the study of war as a science. The world's wars may for our uses be conveniently divided into ancient wars, Middle Age wars, modern wars, recent wars. The eras of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus, Frederick, and Napoleon contain the names of nearly all the great captains. Man is a fighting animal. His club was the first hand-to-hand weapons, his slungstone the early long-range arm. The organization of armies came about in a perfectly simple manner, just as the first stockade around the barbarian village was the origin of the stupendous walls of Babylon. The beginning of all military devices was in the East. They have been perfected in the West. They have been perfected in the West. They have been perfected in the West. The character of all Oriental wars was that of huge raids accompanied by extravagant cruelties and devastation. Entirely unmethodical, they contain no lessons for us today. The first reliable history of war may be said to have come to us from the Jews. The historical books of the Bible give us the earliest written glimpse into very ancient methods of warfare, as the Egyptian monuments give us the pictorial. This narrative was followed by the Iliad, which portrays the condition of war 1,200 years before Christ. Herodotus, 418 BC, next appeared, and by his faithful description of the Persian Wars justly earned the title of Father of History, and following him closely came Thucydides, 384 BC, who narrated the great political and interesting, though in instruction meager, military events of the Peloponnesian War. Xenophon, 360 BC, graphically, if sometimes imaginatively, describes the deeds of the elder Cyrus, and capped all military historical works in his wonderful Anabasis. The same character was kept up by Polybius, Diodorus, Dionysius, Arrian, Plutarch, among the Greeks, and by Caesar, Sallust, Livy, Tacitus, and Nepos among the Romans. That the works of all these and many other authors should deal mostly with war was a necessity. It was war which was, as a rule, the precursor of advancing civilization. From the decline of Rome throughout the Middle Ages, there was no history, properly speaking. Only chronicles and partial notes were kept, nor did history emerge from its hiding until the revival of learning and the arts in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was then patterned, as was everything else, on ancient models. The invention of gunpowder gave a new direction to war and its records, though the classical influence and the certain pedantry in historical work remained until the 18th century. The systems of war partook of this same pedantry, with the exception of what was done by a few great masters, and it was not until the French Revolution overturned all preconceived notions on every subject that the art of war was, as we understand it, arose and throve. The worship of the ancient models gave way to a national sentiment, and the growth of scientific war became assured and permanent, as well as the fruitful study of what the great captains had really done. Military history had been but a record. It became an inquiry into the principles governing the acts recorded. Prince Galitzin's splendid work divides the history of war into 4 sections. A. Ancient War. 1 degree down to 500 BC. 2 degree, 2nd degree. From the beginning of the Persian Wars, 500 BC, down to the death of Alexander, 323 BC. 3 degree, or 3rd. From the death of Alexander, 323 BC, to the death of Caesar, 44 BC. And finally, 4th degree, from the death of Caesar, 44 BC, to the fall of the West Roman Empire, AD 476. B. Wars of the Middle Ages. 1st degree, from AD 476 to the death of Charles the Great, AD 814. 2nd degree, from AD 814 to the introduction of firearms, AD 1350. And finally, 3rd degree, from AD 1350 to the 30 Years' War, AD 1618. C. Modern Wars. 1st degree, the 30 Years' War, AD 1618 to 1648. 2nd degree, wars from AD 1648 to Frederick the Great. And finally, 3rd degree, Frederick's era to the beginning of the French Revolution, AD 1740 to 1792. D. Recent wars. 1st degree, from the French Revolution to 1805. 2nd degree, Napoleon's Wars, AD 1805 to 1815. And finally, 3rd degree, wars since 1815. Personal footnote to remind you, this was written in 1890, so the wars do not extend beyond that. End of personal footnote. Of these several periods, the most important by far to the military student are those which contain the deeds of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar in ancient days, and those of Gustavus, Frederick, and Napoleon in modern times. Few of the other great generals fall without these periods. To narrate the military achievements of these great masters, and incidentally a few others, and to connect them by a mere thread of the intervening events, will suffice to give all which is best in the rise and progress of the science of war. In quotes, read, says Napoleon. Reread the history of their campaigns. Make them your model. This is the sole means of becoming a great captain, and of guessing the secret of the art. End of quote. So long as man existed on the earth, he has been a fighting animal. After settling his quarrels with the weapons of nature, he resorted to clubs and stones, that is, weapons for use hand to hand and at a distance, and no doubt at an early day built himself huts and surrounded them with stakes, stones, and earth, so as to keep away aggressive neighbors. Herein we have the origin of weapons and of fortification. As men joined themselves into communities, the arts of attacks and defense, and their use as applied to numbers, grew. The citizen was always a soldier, but often only a portion of the citizens required to be sent away from home to fight, and this originated standing armies, which became a well-settled institution when conquerors made themselves kings. As man invented useful arts, these were first applied to the demands of war. Bows and arrows, lances, slings, swords, breastplates, and shields came into use, and horses were tamed and employed for war, first as beasts of burden, and then in chariots and for cavalry. Chariots and horses for cavalry were first adopted because they afforded the fighters a higher position from which to cast their weapons, as well as rendered their aspect more dreadful. Elephants and camels came into warfare for a similar reason. No doubt chariots antedated cavalry. Troops began by fighting in masses without settled order, and the victory was won by those who had the bravest, strongest, or most numerous array. With better weapons came greater order. The best armed warriors were placed together. The slingers could not do good work side by side with the pikeman, nor the charioteer or mounted man with the foot soldier. Thus, certain tactical formations arose, and as the more intelligent soldiers were put in charge of the less so, rank and command appeared. It was soon found that the light-armed bowmen and slingers could best use their weapons and most rapidly move in open skirmishing order, that the heavy-armed pikemen and swordsmen could best give decisive blows when plowed into masses. The growth of army organization came about in a perfectly natural sequence, and grew side by side with all other pursuits. Fortification originated in a similar manner. Tribes built their villages in inaccessible places, on rocks or hills, and surrounded them with ditches, stockades, or loosely piled walls. Such simple habitations gradually grew into fortified cities, and the walls and ditches increased in size and difficulty of approach. Inner citadels were built, and towers crowned the walls to enable these to be swept by missiles if reached by the besiegers. The art of sieges was of much later and more formal growth. For many generations, fortified cities were deemed inexpugnable, and artifice or hunger were resorted to for their capture. But gradually it was found that walls could be undermined or weakened or breached, or that they could be mounted by various means, and the art of besieging cities began to take on form. As tribes grew into nations, war assumed larger dimensions. As a rule, it was brute weight alone which accomplished results, but sometimes the weaker party would resort to stratagems to defend itself, such as declining battle, and making instead thereof night or partial attacks, defending river fords or mountain passes, and falling on the enemy from ambush or from cities. Out of such small beginnings of moral opposition to physical preponderance has come into existence, by slow degrees and through many centuries, what we now know as the science of war. Except the Phoenicians and Jews, the Oriental nations of remote antiquity were divided into castes, of which the most noble or elevated were alone entitled to bear arms, and to this profession they were trained with scrupulous care. The military caste in some nations was wont to monopolize all offices and political control. In others it wielded a lesser sway. The existence of such castes gave rise to what eventually, became standing armies, and from the ranks of these were chosen the king's bodyguard, always an important factor in Oriental government. The Phoenicians first employed mercenary troops. A paid force enabled the citizens to continue without interruption the commercial life on which their power rested. But such troops were of necessity unreliable. Egypt and Persia in later times employed mercenaries in large numbers. In addition to those methods of recruitment, drafts of entire districts or partial drafts of the country were usual. These swelled the standing armies caste or mercenary to a huge size, but furnished an unreliable material which against good troops was in itself a source of weakness, but which often won against similarly constituted bodies. The methods of conducting war in organization and tactics were always on the low scale in the Orient. The origin of every military device is in the East. Successive steps towards improvement were made in Europe by the Greeks and Romans. Despite that, a certain luxurious civilization rose to a higher grade among the Orientals. The military instinct of these downtrodden races was less marked than among the freemen of the West. In one respect alone, cavalry, were the Oriental nations superior. This superiority was owing to the excellence of their horses and to the prevalence of horsemanship among them. In all other branches they fell distinctly below the Europeans. The chief characteristic of the operations of the ancient Orientals was that of huge raids or wars of conquest, which overran vast territories and often led to the conflict of enormous armies, to the extinguishment or enslaving of nations, or to long drawn-out sieges of capitals or commercial cities. In battles it was sought by stratagem to fall on, and by preponderance of force to surround and annihilate the enemy. All operations were accompanied by dire inhumanity to individuals and to peoples, by the shedding of blood and destruction of property beyond compute. But they have furnished no contribution to the art of war. And here we see a picture, line drawing, contour drawing by the author of an Assyrian mounted archer. And that ends chapter 2. Chapter 3. Early Oriental Armies. Among the ancient Oriental nations, military service was generally confined to a caste. Infantry was the bulk, cavalry the flower of the Oriental armies. Light troops came from the poorer classes and were miserably clad and armed with bows and slings. The heavy foot, drawn from the richer classes, was, as a rule, splendidly armed and equipped. There was plenty of courage in the Eastern armies, but small discipline and ensemble. There was no strategic maneuvering. Armies simply met and fought. Battle was opened by the light troops. The chariots then charged and were followed up by an advance of the heavy foot, while the cavalry sought to surround the flanks of the enemy. The parallel order was universal, and open plains were chosen as battlefields. The Jews had, even under Moses, a fine organization. There was a sort of landwehr of 288,000 men, of which a twelfth was always on duty. While using other armies, the sling remained a favorite weapon. The Jews learned much of war from the Philistines. The Egyptians were excellent soldiers in early times, but their chariots and cavalry were gradually driven out of the extension of the canal system, which prevented their maneuvering, and mercenaries crept into use to the detriment of the service. The Egyptian formation was generally in huge squares of 100 files, 100 deep. The Persians had a hereditary warrior caste, and were in early history very warlike. Cyrus began his wonderful career of conquest with but 30,000 infantry. Cavalry he accumulated afterwards. The Persians learned much from the conquered Medes in the way of technical skill. Their army contained many fine bodies of troops. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Medes. The army organization of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Medes had a similar origin and much common likeness in form. Military service was the sole right of a certain caste, and among the Medes was looked on as the highest of pursuits. The standing armies consisted of the king's bodyguard, often very large, particular corps under command of nobles of high degree, which helped to sustain the centralized government, and provincial troops. The population was divided into bodies of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, each of which furnished its quota of men, and the army was itself organized on a decimal basis. A vast horde of nomads, mostly horse, and excellent of its kind, was wont to accompany the regular army, either for pay or in hope of plunder. And here the author has drawn 3 different types of Assyrian warriors. That's Assyrian warriors. Infantry consisted or constituted the bulk, cavalry, the flower of the Oriental armies. For many generations after the Greek infantry had shown to the world its superiority over any other, the Oriental cavalry was still far ahead of that of Greece. The Greeks were not horsemen, nor their hilly country as well suited for horse breeding as the level plains of Asia. It is a truism, however, that a nation of horsemen overrun a nation of footmen conquer a country. The Greeks and Romans were examples of this. The argument of the light troops consisted of bows and slings. They wore no defensive armor. The nobles and well-to-do who served as heavy troops were superbly armed and equipped. They bore sword, battle-axe, javelins, pike and dagger, or some of these. And here's a picture the author has drawn of Babylonian heavy foot, Babylonian slinger, and Babylonian chariot. Though few in number, the heavy armed were the one nucleus of value. There was no idea of strategic maneuvering. Armies marched out to seek each other and fought when they met. The troops were ranked for battle by order of nationalities, generally in a long and often more or less concave order, so as, if possible, to surround the enemy. The foot stood in the center, the cavalry on the wings. The front was covered by chariots. The formation was in massed squares, often 100 or more deep. The archers and slingers swarmed in the front of all, and opened the battle with a shower of light missiles. They then retired through the intervals between the squares of the advancing main line or around its flanks, and continued their fire from its rear. The chariots then rushed in at a gallop and sought to break the enemy's line, generally by massing a charge on some one point. These were followed by the heavy footmen, who covered with their shields and pike in hand, under the inspiration of the trumpet, and led by bearers of insignia, such as birds and beasts of prey, or sacred emblems mounted on long lances like our battle flags, sought to force their way by weight of mass into the breaches made by the chariots, while the cavalry swept round the flanks and charged in on the rear of the enemy. And here the author drew a couple of examples of military insignia. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting then ensued. The Orientals were far from lacking courage. It was mobility and discipline they wanted. That army which could overlap the enemy or had the stronger line, unless the enemy protected its front and flanks with chariots or chosen troops, was apt to win, and the beaten army was annihilated. Battles were generally fought on open plains. It never seemed to occur to these people to lean a flank on a natural obstacle, such as a wood or river. An unfortunate turn in a battle could not be retrieved. The capital cities were splendidly fortified. Nineveh, Babylon, Ecbatana had stone walls of extraordinary thickness and height. Those of Nineveh were still 150 feet high in Xenophon's time. And here the author drew a Median scythe chariot and an Assyrian archer. Babylon had two walls. An outer one, stated by Herodotus as 335 feet high and 85 feet thick, and by Ctesias at almost these dimensions, and with a correspondingly wide ditch. The citadel was a marvel of strength, so far as massiveness was concerned. The art of engineering, as applied to sieges, was not highly developed. The The mechanical means of the day were not as well adapted for besieging as for fortification, and the defense of a city was rendered desperate by the uniform penalty of its surrender or capture, which was death or slavery. The Assyrians are said to have fortified their temporary camps generally in circular form. Jews. Among the Jews, every man over 20 years of age, with certain stated exceptions, was a warrior. The 12 tribes each furnished a corps, which at the time of the flight from Egypt was, on the average, 50,000 strong. From this corps, in times of war, the needed number of recruits was selected by lot or route. It was a draft, pure and simple. Saul first established a bodyguard in David's time. 1025 BC. The number of Jews fit for war was 1,300,000, and each tribe furnished 24,000 men for active duty. And here the author has drawn a Hebrew pikeman, two Hebrew pikemen, and a heavy footman. One of these bodies served each month under a captain who reviewed it and was held responsible for its effectiveness. The whole body of 288,000 men was a sort of landwehr, in which 1/12 was constantly under arms. The organization was on a decimal basis of tens, hundreds, and thousands. Solomon largely increased the number of cavalry and chariots, and perfected their organization and discipline. On the flight from Egypt, the Israelites were in possession of no weapons. They partially armed themselves from those cast up by the sea after the destruction of the Egyptians. Their arms, during the latter part of their wanderings, were bows, slings, and darts. Until they reached the Promised Land, they had no forged weapons. The Philistines, or dwellers in Palestine, were better provided and were familiar with both cavalry and chariots. At a latter day, the Jews acquired and used short, wide, curved swords and lances. But the sling always remained a favorite weapon, and in its use they were curiously expert. In the corps d'élite of the time of the judges, which consisted of 26,000 men who drew the sword, was a body of 700 left-handed slingers who could cut a hair hung up as a target. So early as the time of Moses, even the drill and discipline of the Jewish army was considerable. The method of battle was similar to that of other nations. The light troops in the van opened the battle in loose order. The heavy infantry in deep masses followed after. They fought under the inspiration of horns and battle cries. They sometimes stood in 3 lines, light troops, main body, 10 to 30 men deep, and a reserve of picked troops. Martial insignia representing animals were usually carried in the ranks. The Jews had a great numbers to encounter. The Philistines came against Saul with 6,000 cavalry, 30,000 chariots, and foot-like to the sands of the seashore in number. And here the author has drawn a Hebrew archer and drawn from I suppose that's a coin or a piece of sandstone, a slinger. Sorry. There is the slinger. And there you have the archer. Followed by a Hebrew irregular. Right. And the Egyptian king in war dress. These are all contour drawings by the author. In the war against Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, David captured 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 infantry. Solomon kept on foot 1,400 chariots and 12,000 cavalry. He had stalls for 40,000 chariot horses, which probably included the equipages for the royal household and the army trains. These figures, compared with the numbers of chariots at Thimbra and Arbela, seem exaggerated, but they serve to show that the main reliance for the day was on chariots rather than on cavalry. A careful military organization no doubt existed. We read in Holy Writ that David appointed Joab captain general over his army, with 27 lieutenants under him, and that his army was divided into 3 corps. There was clearly an established rank in command. Under Moses, the Jews fortified their daily camp in form of a square. But permanent fortification of cities they only learned after conquering Palestine. Jerusalem was strongly fortified by David on the method then usual among the Orientals. Egyptians. Thebes and Memphis appear to have had the earliest Egyptian military organization, but shortly after 1500 BC, the first pharaoh welded Egypt into one body. The warrior caste was at the head of the society, second only to the priestly caste. Under the Sesostratoi, 1500 to 1200 BC, the army organization grew in effectiveness. The father of Sesostris, at the time of this great king's birth, selected all the boys in Egypt born on the same day, and made them a military school, out of which later grew Sesostris' confidential bodyguard. And next, the author has illustrated an Egyptian soldier in scale armor and an Egyptian soldier in a linen breastplate. Linen and breastplate, or linen breastplate. I'm not sure how that... Let's see what we got there. You see those titles? All right. Among the number were many of his generals. Sesostris first gave rewards in land to his soldiers, as feudal kings did in later centuries, and obliged these dependents, as a consideration for their tenure, to go to war with him at their own cost, and always to be prepared to perform this duty. The Egyptian army was over 400,000 strong. The youths of the warrior caste were carefully trained. All records and traditions agree that the Egyptians were excellent soldiers. The chief punishment for breach of discipline was loss of honor, which, however, the warrior could, by single acts of bravery, regain. By 1200 BC came the decline of the Egyptian power, and under Psammetichus, mercenary troops from Asia Minor and Greece gradually supplanted the warrior caste. Infantry constituted the bulk of the forces. Chariots were common even in remote antiquity, as well as cavalry. These decreased in usefulness, however, as the canal system of Egypt grew and left small room for maneuvering. The weapons were the usual arms: bows, lances, slings, axes, darts, and swords. The Egyptian soldiers were light and heavy, irregular and regular. Some carried shields covering the entire body and wore helmets and mail. The army had martial, music, and the emblem of the sacred bull or crocodile was carried on a lance as a standard. Xenophon, in the Chiropedia, describes their tactics at the Battle of Thymbra. They stood in large, dense masses, very deep, often in squares of 100 files of 100 men, and covered by linked shields and protruded lances, were dangerous to attack. And here is another drawing of a couple of common Egyptian soldiers. The Egyptians fortified their camps in rectangular form and built extensive walls to protect their borders. Sesostris erected one extending from Pelusium to Heliopolis. Their cities were fortified with walls of several stories, but as with other nations at this period, the art of sieges was little advanced. Ashdod, though not strongly fortified, resisted. Psammetichus, 29 years. Sesostris is supposed to have had 600,000 infantry, 27,000 chariots, and 24,000 horse. He is said to have conquered Ethiopia, then crossed from Meroe to Arabia, Petria, and thence made excursions as far as India. He later sailed to Phoenicia and overran a large part of Asia Minor. Sesostris is alleged to have conquered territory as far east as the Oxus and Indus, and to have levied contributions on the populations of these countries. But his conquest had no duration, even if what is related of him by tradition has a more than problematical basis of truth. Next, we have some illustrations of a Persian soldier and a Persian irregular. Persians. Under Cyrus, the warrior caste was not only the uppermost, but was hereditary, and at all times thoroughly prepared for war. Assuming the Chiropedia to be exact, Cyrus undertook his great conquest with but 30,000 men, which later increased to 70,000 and still more by accessions from the conquered provinces. In all these provinces a colonel of Persian troops was stationed, but the local government was uniformly preserved. This proceeding testifies to the keen good sense of Cyrus, who left behind him contented peoples, under satraps closely watched by his own Persian officers. His course was later imitated by Alexander the Great, with equally satisfactory results. Cyrus subdued as large a part of Asia as Alexander did after him, holding the cities as points d'appui as he went along. During his lifetime, Persian discipline was excellent. After his death, contact with the luxury of the Medes destroyed much of his structure. The Chiropaedia is, however, a sort of military romance into which Xenophon has woven his own military experience and astuteness. It is full of exaggerated hero worship. While its main features are correct, its details are unquestionably dressed up. But it has nonetheless as great value as it has charm. The Persians fought mainly on foot. There were few horses in Persia proper, but Cyrus found cavalry necessary against the Asiatics, who had much which was excellent. He collected 10,000 horsemen from various sources, and at Thumbra used the body to good advantage. This was the origin of the superb Persian cavalry of latter days. The foot had bows, slings, darts, and small shields to begin with, but gradually bettered these weapons as they hewed their way into Asia, and thereafter used battle axes and swords, and wore helmet and mail. Thus, from what was at first but a species of light infantry grew up a latter body of heavy foot, in addition to much that remained light. And here we have another drawing of a Persian warrior. The Persian foot had been marshaled 30 deep. Cyrus reduced it to 12 ranks. The cavalry was divided in a similar manner. The bulk was light horse, coming mainly from the nomad allies. A lesser part was heavy armed. Cyrus also had scythe chariots, and Xenophon describes at the battle of Thumbra the use of towers on wheels filled with armed men, together with other curious devices, and camels carrying archers and catapults. Questionable but interesting assertions. In the art of fortification and sieges, the Persians had made little or no advance, but they learned something from the Medes and other Asiatics, and gradually acquired the use of catapults and rams. But stratagem, as the Sardes, after the battle of Thumbra, had generally to be put into practice to capture towns unless hunger speedily reduced them. Nebuchadnezzar besieged old Tyre 13 years and failed to take it. Cambyses, son of Cyrus, divided the male population of his kingdom into children, youths, men, old men. Each class had 12 chiefs, chosen from among the last two classes. Every lad of 10 began his career by entering the first. Here he stayed till 20, among the youths till 30, among the men till 40, and until 55 he was in the last class. After this he was free from military duty. Each class had its special occupations and discipline. This distribution is rather curious than valuable. And here we have a picture of an Assyrian arms bearer ending the chapter. End of chapter 3.